Hi, I'm Robyn Frampton and I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager for Visual Connections. Welcome to this one of our first seminars in the Visual Connections Virtual Expo. Today I'm going to take you through some of the principles of good communications, and we're going to have a chat about why communications is important, particularly in times of crisis. I'm just going to share a PowerPoint with you. So let's see, I hope that you will all be able to see this. Okay, so let's get going. Communicating in a crisis. So why is communicating in a crisis vital? Well, communicating well is always important. In a crisis, it's even more important. That's because it allows you to share information, which is just absolutely vital. Engage with your audiences, and keeping in touch is just so important, as we've found out in the last few weeks and months. And it allows you to drive action, and probably the most important action is that it allows you to get feedback from your audiences about what they're expecting from you during a crisis, and to get an idea of how it's impacting on them. So, in a crisis, we're facing a range of issues and challenges that perhaps we don't normally see or are not normally highlighted. Confusion. So, the nature, scope, and cause of a crisis can cause confusion. What's happening? How's it going to impact on me? How are we going to move forward? Panic and anxiety. I think over the last little while, probably most of us have been operating at least at some level of anxiety, some more than others. Some people are impacted more than others. So that's something we have to take into account with our communications as well. There's a disruption to familiar channels. Now, in the current situation, we just don't have access to that person-to-person contact we might be used to. There's very real restrictions around how we can meet, how we can gather. We can't go to expos. So we need to rely on different channels, perhaps, from what we're not normally used to, and so that can create its own challenges. This is a really important one, the pressure to respond quickly, and I think as communicators, we feel that pressure, and particularly in times of crisis. I think that's a really important one to keep in mind, and we'll come to that a little bit later. And final one, I would say, is consistency of messaging. Partly due to the confusion that we're talking about, but it's really important to get that consistency of messaging across your team and across your channels. So, to summarise, in a crisis, the frequency, clarity, and style of your communications can make all the difference. So let's have a look at things. There's no roadmap for success. Every crisis is different, every situation is different, every company is different. So you're going to have to kind of work it out a little bit for yourself, but I hope these principles will help. Remember that in a crisis, your comms do double duty. People are more tuned to finding out what you have to say on subjects, and you need to make sure that they're covering for perhaps the things that you can't be doing in a crisis. And the basic principle of all your communications, as it always should be, is that your relationships should come first. So, as I said, the principles of good communication hold true in any situation. So here are my top 10 in this or any other crisis, in any crisis situation or any situation. Firstly, be intentional. So now I just want to have a little chat about that one. Your mum probably told you to think before you speak, and in crisis communications, there's no more important part of the process than the thinking behind things. If there's one thing that I would like you to take away from this webinar, is that thinking about your communications, planning well, both for crises and communications, is the one thing that you can do that will really stand you in good stead. So whatever you do and whatever you take away from this webinar today, this need to be intentional, to really think about what you're doing and what you're saying, is the absolute key. So stick with me for at least this part of the webinar, and then if you've got to go, just that'll be the crux of it. So If you can get your thinking right, your communications will nearly always be on track. So let's have a look at the PowerPoint again. We'll come back to that. So if you have a crisis plan, a communication strategy and a social media policy, now's the time to bring those things into effect. Don't wing it in a crisis situation. It's not the time to be making policy on the run, despite the fact that sometimes, as we've seen in the past few weeks, you do need to do that. If you don't have these things, now's a good time to pull your task force together internally and to sort out the basics. So what are those basics? Take it one step at a time. So your comms is not going to be your first concern in a crisis, and it shouldn't be your first concern in a crisis. The first thing is always to make sure is everybody safe, and as far as possible, is the situation under control. Once you've done that though, have a look at what information you have. Now, in a crisis, information, verifiable information, is often a moving feast. So it's important to just pause every now and then and say, what do we actually know? What information do we have? Because that's the basis of where you go from there. Secondly, who needs to know that information? Let's not waste our resources telling everybody everything, but at the same time, we need to make sure that certain audiences hear the information that they need to know from us when they need to know it. Who's authorised to comment? This comes back to your social media policy and your comms strategy, but it's important to have an authorised person or people who can make statements on behalf of your organisation or who can release information as it comes to hand. That may be one person, maybe it's the CEO or the business owner, maybe it's a number of people, as we've seen with the COVID-19 response. Sometimes it's good to have several people. We've got a national task force, but where things are to do with national strategy, the Prime Minister's been speaking on those. Where it's to do with the medical advice, we've heard from the Chief Health Officer or the Chief Health Officers in the various states. And where it relates to local regulations, the premiers of the states and territories have been the ones to make comment, and that's entirely appropriate. So have a think about who's authorised to comment and on what. Finally, have a think about what your approved messaging is. Now, this is kind of putting a general comms spin on what can be a very unusual situation, but have a script and make sure that people know what that is. If you've got a number of people who are dealing with media or who are dealing with your audiences or who are posting to your social media, make sure everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet. And that probably means making sure that the communications between yourselves are really good at the time. We also need to think about where the audience is and what stage of the process that they're at. And this is just a handy little graph, which I think you'll be able to look back at in future. It's a bit detailed to go through in any great detail for this webinar, but it just goes through the various stages that people tend to be in during a crisis and what's appropriate or not appropriate. So, for example, in the first group of a crisis, it's all around safety. Am I safe? How am I going to be impacted by this? What's actually happening? There's a great deal of uncertainty. There's anxiety and fear. And unsurprisingly, this is not the time to be doing the hard sell. So it's the time to be calm, to be reassuring, hold back on your communications, just communicate when it's absolutely necessary, but leave the sales to a later stage. We then move through a period of disruption and change, which is kind of where we're at the moment, and what's the new normal going to look like. So there's still that uncertainty, but people are starting to adjust to the changes and starting to look for practical ways to respond. And this is where we can start to amp up the communications a little bit and start to position ourselves as being able to help or offer solutions or respond in some way to the disruption that's happening. Finally, we'll get to a stage where there will be back to normal, or a new normal. And this is where we can really start to get back to a more normal flow of communications, but always bearing in mind that we need to adjust perhaps what we're doing, or at least reassess what we were doing in light of what that new normal might be. So that includes things like your messaging, it includes your offer, it includes your brand voice and your brand identity. And so having a look at all of those things, but getting back to a normal flow of communication with your various audiences. I think perhaps that another thing to say at this stage, and I'll just pop that on pause for a minute, is that every crisis is different. And so your response in every crisis is going to be a little bit different. If you have a major incident at your production plant, your response is going to be very different from in the current situation. It's a situation which only impacts on your immediate workforce. In the first instance, it might impact on the supply that you can offer to your clients, and it might have a much broader impact in that it might make news, it might involve police and emergency services. So there's a whole range of things that will impact on that. In the current situation, we're looking at something which is impacting the market more broadly. There's very broad uncertainty, and you and your suppliers and your manufacturers are all going to be in this together and trying to work around the situation. So your communications and your style of communications and your ability to respond is going to be different in each situation. Good communications are always tailored to the situation at hand. So let's move on to the next principle, which is to be visible. Getting back to the current situation, that's something that has been quite a challenge, I know, for a number of organisations during this current time, because some of our normal channels of communication, as we talked about earlier, have been disrupted and may not be available. Don't drop out of sight. That's the main thing. Be proactive in the initial phases. If you are impacted by a crisis, contact your key stakeholders and perhaps your media first, and make sure that they know you're still around, you're available to talk, and that if they want information, they should come to you first. You can worry about the rest later, but just make sure those things are covered. More broadly, select the platforms that you can use for regular communications. So that might be your social media channels, it might be email, it might be document sharing platforms or virtual meeting hubs. In some instances, it may actually be fronting the media and taking a more public stance. Work out what platforms you're going to use, then let everybody know where they can find you. It's no good speaking into the abyss. You need to not only be on certain channels, you also need to point your audiences towards those channels. And then, of course, show up regularly. Again, it's no good how many people are following you on social media if you never post anything. So make sure that you're visible. Important note here, you don't have to wait until you have all the information. In a crisis situation, that's virtually never going to be possible anyway. You don't need to make sure that you have all the information at hand, but you do need to make sure that you stick to the facts when you get out there and you communicate. If you don't know, it's okay to say so. It's okay to say, we don't know at this stage, we're investigating, we're trying to work out, we're working with the authorities, we're talking to our suppliers, and we'll let you know as soon as we know. And make sure you do let them know. This third one, you would think is obvious, but it's surprisingly how often people fall down on this. Be clear. People impacted by a crisis are often dealing with a lot of information as once, so you need to keep your communications as concise and as simple as possible. Why? Because poorly planned communications can actually contribute to the information overload that people are invariably already suffering in a crisis. So don't do that. it can create uncertainty, and we've seen a bit of that in the current situation, haven't we, whereby poorly structured communications have actually added to confusion rather than resolving confusion. If you don't plan, also, it can lead to you releasing the wrong information inadvertently, or to sharing information too soon, or to sharing information in the wrong order. That often comes down to stress. You know, we feel a bit panicked, we want to get something out there, but again, this is where your planning is going to really kick into action to stop you making missteps that are easily avoided if you do the thinking first and then speak later. So let's look at a bit of an example here. So I've looked at a statement by the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and one from the Victorian Premier, Dan Andrews. These were given one day apart in April, and they were dealing with the stay-at-home restrictions and also referring to the growing unemployment problems and the difficulties that Centrelink were facing. So in these, you'll be easily able to see the differences in their styles and probably the reason for the different commentary around their communications. I'm a Victorian, so I've heard a lot from Dan Andrews as well as from Scott Morrison, and the differences in their styles is quite stark. I think this will give you an idea. So I'm not going to read all of this to you, but let's just look at the first paragraph. We are not unconscious of the real impacts that these measures are having on the daily lives of Australians, and so we'll continue to do everything we can, both as a federal government and as a state and territory governments around the country, to do all we can to support our people through what is going to be an incredibly difficult time. And he goes on, and our goal is to get through this together, and by following common sense rules, doing the right thing, that's how we slow the spread of this virus, and that's how we save lives. Nothing wrong with that in a communication sense, but it is quite convoluted and it is quite word heavy. It's quite, he's using lots of long words, that's his style, but it is quite heavy going. Here's Dan Andrews in contrast. We don't take these actions lightly, but to put it bluntly, if we don't slow this thing down, we won't just have people waiting in line for Centrelink, we'll have people waiting in line for machines to help them breathe. There's no social occasion or celebration that's worth more than a human life. For Victorians, that means if you can stay home, you must stay home. Very different style, and really clear, and achieves that cut through that perhaps some of Scott Morrison's communications haven't. Good to know, though, that we're not necessarily alone. And here's Matt Lucas doing what I think is a pretty good imitation of Boris Johnson.
So we are saying, don't go to work, go to work. Don't take public transport, go to work, don't go to work. Stay indoors. If you can work from home, go to work. Don't go to work. Go outside, don't go outside. And then we will or won't do something or other.
So, how do you avoid the pitfalls here? So, first thing, draft your message, read your message, and then reread your message. It's amazing how often we read what we think we wrote and not necessarily what we wrote. Make sure that you draft, read, and reread. If you can, walk away from it, come back to it a bit later. It doesn't have to be, you know, sleep on it, but come back to it when you've had a bit of a walk, gone on, done a different task, come back to it and you'll see things that you didn't see the first time. If you have the opportunity to do that, run it past a trusted other person and get their feedback on it. What do they see in your messaging that you perhaps don't see yourself? Above all, when you're communicating, particularly in times of crisis, it has to be a two-way street. So no matter what the vehicle for your communications is, make sure that you include an offer for invitation, or an invitation for people to contact you if they don't understand something or if they feel that they want to give you feedback. The aim of this, as much as anything, as much as sharing information, is to create a dialogue and to show that you're being approachable, that you're being honest, and that you're being transparent. And that brings us to the next principle, which is to be transparent. So I'm just going to stop the share again there and just talk to you about transparency, because I think this is something that we really need to pay attention to, particularly in this day and age. Even though you might want to hold back information, and sometimes it's perfectly reasonable to hold back information, for example, if you need to let key stakeholders or particularly affected parties know about something before you release it more publicly, it's almost impossible. It's always been almost impossible to hide what's happening. The truth will out, as they say. In today's hyper-connected world, it's virtually impossible. There just simply is no way. When every one of your staff members, every one of your customers, and everyone in the market more generally has access to publishing tools, you simply can't keep things under wraps. So transparency is really important. So let's look at what that looks like. First, so be transparent as you can, particularly with your own team and with your key stakeholders. Don't hide anything. Don't hold back information, and provide as much detail as you possibly can, taking into account the caveats that we've just talked about, because it's usually futile anyway, and you're just going to look really bad if you try and do that. So where there is real verifiable information that impacts your team, your customers, or the wider market, you should let them know as clearly and as soon as you possibly can. The clearer picture you can provide to all parties, the better. Now, this may all be creating greater levels of stress for you, but here's number 5, and that is be calm, or at least try and appear to be calm. In an uncertain world, we all feel a bit untethered. Your audience, not to mention yourself and your own team, are probably feeling unsettled and anxious and even fearful. So in your business communications, it's easy to let that sort of bleed through. But it's important for you to try and take a step back and remain, or at least appear, as calm as you possibly can. Contributing to the stress levels isn't going to help. So the first thing that you can do, again, is step back and have a think about it. What does your audience need from me in this situation? And I would say the first thing is sound information. What's the situation? What's likely to be the impact? What actions are you taking or planning? And what's the time frame around these things? That type of factual information that will give them something to hang on to in an uncertain situation. Reassurance. Let them know that you're on top of the situation. Again, even if it's only to say, we don't know, but we're working to find out. Confidence in your ability to respond. And a great deal of that, at least in the initial stages, will be showing that you're under control, that you're calm, and that you're working through things. If you look like you've lost the plot, they're likely to lose the plot as well. So even if you're panicking off screen, don't panic on screen. Also, your audience is going to need to be updated. As things change, make sure that you get back to them and you let them know. So again, step-by-step process. Mentally step back. Take a deep breath. Remind yourself that this is what your audiences need from you. Stay calm. Then stick to the facts. Avoid speculation. We'll get to that again a little bit later, but don't speculate. Stick to the facts when you're communicating with your audiences. Acknowledge the difficulties. You can say this is a challenging situation, but don't catastrophize. In a situation like this, as always, I'm a big believer in the fact that the words you use really matter. In this situation, your words really do make a difference. So think carefully about what you're going to say. Think about the difference, and I'm just going to turn this off again for a moment. Think about the difference in the general media coverage of the COVID-19 situation. There's been what I would call mainstream media coverage, what I would call trusted media coverage, and then there's been what I would characterise as perhaps shock jock coverage. And while you might hear the mainstream media say that this is a challenging situation, or that certain industries are facing enormous challenges, that there's been a sharp downturn in the economy, things like that, what you hear from the shock jocks or others in the media are words like disastrous. There's been a catastrophic collapse of the systems. Situations may be unprecedented. They may be dire. They may be incredibly challenging. But to contribute to that by using words that inflame the situation is not going to help you. It's really just going to, again, increase that level of anxiety and actually undermine the effectiveness of your communications. So, what does good communication look like in this situation? Well, I've got an example and I'm going to share this with you just to show you what a good communications look like. So, this is a letter that I received probably 4 to 6 weeks into the the lockdown situation. And it's from a local real estate agent and a guy called Simon. And he says, "Dear Robyn, firstly, I hope you and your family are keeping safe during these challenging times. As the COVID-19 situation continues to evolve in Australia and across the globe, I wanted to reach out and offer my assistance. Like many in this adaptable environment, we're working from home, but continue to service our clients." He goes on to say how his team are working from home and to acknowledge that COVID-19 has impacted people differently and financially, and that might mean that readers need trusted advice. He goes on to point to his own deep knowledge and understanding of the property market. He points to the expertise of his team and their availability, and he also is able to show some resources, which I'll just give you a glimpse at in a minute, about so some resources that they've put together on the company's website. So he gives me access to a whole range of information. And he ends just by asking the reader to stay safe and providing his personal details, including his mobile number for contact. Now, it's unlikely that many people took him up on that, but it makes him really available and approachable. It's calm, it's informative, it's empathetic, and it's reassuring. It's got all the qualities of really good communications. It gives me good information, and it tells me where to go, either to him or to the website for more information. And here's what they've done on their website. They've actually put together some blogs, and if you can read those little titles, they're actually targeted to particular parts of the market. So there's a landlord FAQ, there's a tenant FAQ, there's let's go back. There's a hardship, a thing on hardship provisions. There's something for mortgage holders. There's something for people who are planning to sell. There are something for people who are planning to buy. So they've really put the work in, they've put the information together, and they've then gone out and made that information available. That's great communications. So moving right along, the next thing is, and this comes back to the planning, is be cautious. Just again comes back to taking a step back, taking a deep breath, thinking things through and putting plans in place before you go rushing into anything. Be careful with the information you think and the information you share. And when things are changing fast, it's even more important to be extra cautious. So what does that mean in practice? Firstly, choose reputable sources. Find reputable sources and either share links or pass on expert information without trying to interpret too much. Remember what happens each time Donald Trump tries to interpret the medical facts for the media. We don't want to get there. So try to answer the questions. Don't try to answer questions if you don't have facts. It's okay to say, we actually don't know at this stage. We're working on it. We'll let you know when we know. So keep it simple, particularly where it impacts your business. Be clear about changes to protocols and procedures, even your ability to conduct business or how that's going to change. Stick to accurate and verifiable facts and keep it simple. Don't make it up. Again, let's go back to the Donald. Don't make stuff up. Stick to the facts. Avoid editorializing. Next, be consistent. And this gets back to what we were saying earlier, which is that it's important to get your team all singing from the same song sheet. Be consistent in your messaging. So that's across your team and across your different channels. It's particularly challenging when you're managing multiple channels or when you have a number of different authorised spokespeople, but that's when it's even more important to keep the controls in place. Keep your content consistent and keep your tone consistent. So why are those two things important? So consistent messaging or content avoids confusion and frustration. So if you're hearing different things from different people, that's never going to be good. Consistent tone underpins your brand identity and it strengthens your relationship with your audience. So that's why it's really important, getting back to the planning, to understand what your brand identity is and what that brand voice should be. That's something that you can do offline that has real benefits when you go online. Brand strategy, communication strategy really pays dividends to have those things in place. So if you don't have it, now might be a great time, particularly if there are some parts of business that you can't conduct as normal, to take a step back and get those things in place. There are some great online resources that'll help step you through the process of putting those strategies together, or better still, work with a marketing and communications professional who'll be able to help you create a tailored solution for your own business. So we can't go into that in any detail here, but we can certainly go, certainly there are some good resources for you in that. Basics are, make sure somebody's in charge, central source of control for all your communications. That'll make sure you stay consistent with your agreed brand voice and stick to your comms strategy. Tighten permissions about who is and isn't able to act as spokesperson or create content, and make sure you keep on top of moderating and managing your different channels. That brings us to the next point, which is to remain alert. Firstly, get on the front foot. Don't leave it for people to come to you. Identify the people who have a stake in this and get on the front foot. So that might be your staff, customers, shareholders, directors, whoever, or key media industry bodies. Bring them in on the conversation early. Often you'll find that early transparency and timely responses are the key to minimising negativity or to taking back or keeping control of the situation. Diarise your media management, whether that's creating content for socials or getting in touch with the trade media, whatever that is. Put it in your diary and make sure that you get onto it, make sure that you're on there checking and managing the content. Address any issues as soon as you possibly can. Again, a good social media strategy, and socials is where this is particularly important. Address any issues that come up as soon as possible. Identify where there might be a problem, why things might be getting off the rails, and get onto it. Socials, monitor, moderate, manage. Can be a minefield because you don't have control over the communications necessarily. You have control over half of the communications, which is what you're putting out, but you don't have control over the other part, which is what people are contributing. Social media is a conversation. You're inviting people to have a conversation with you. You can't control their side of the communication. So again, this is something that we can't go into in too much detail in this particular webinar, but I'll be doing a webinar a bit later in our virtual trade show, and that'll go into these issues in more detail. Basics though, monitor your channels constantly, moderate them. That means get in there and get involved and move quickly to manage any issues that might be arising. So if there's a negative comment, get onto it straight away. Just a cautionary tale, Target was involved in 2016 in a situation where somebody took offence at their range of clothes for 3 to 7 year old girls, thinking that they were a little bit too fashion forward, shall we say. There was one negative post, and it was posted on the weekend on Target's Facebook page. By Monday morning, that post had attracted over 60,000 likes and more than 3,000 comments, most of whom agreed with the original poster. It also, by the end of the weekend, got national media attention. And this is all before Target had responded to the original poster. You can't let social media channels go. It's one of those things people think it doesn't cost anything. It costs an enormous amount in terms of creating content, but also in that ongoing moderation. You just got to keep on top of it. I'm tipping that the Target social media manager had a lovely weekend and then had a pretty terrible week thereafter. So check your feeds regularly, both in and out of hours. Again, take time, take a step back, consider your audience's view, even if it's not aligned with your own, then respond promptly. Think first, but don't take too long about it. Take any abusive or super negative conversations offline. It's okay to say, direct message me, send me your phone number and we'll do that. I'm investigating that. Can you give me your email and I'll follow up with you directly? But take it offline if you possibly can. And know your procedures for removing posts or for blocking contributors. So again, that comes back to social media policy. If you know what the lines of procedure are, then it's much easier to deal with those situations when they occur. Now, let's just hop back on now, because the next thing I want to talk about is authenticity. And that's something that people often struggle with, because what does it mean to be authentic? Again, this is not necessarily about being authentic as yourself, although that is important too. This is about being authentic in terms of who you are as an organisation. Now, with a bit of luck, either as a business owner, as a senior management or a key decision maker, or as a communications manager, you've got a pretty good idea of who you are as an organisation and what that means. It's important that in your communications, you remain authentic to that identity. So let's have a little look at that. Be authentic. Don't put the mask up. Pretense is almost always obvious. So if you're not in a position where you can genuinely represent your brand identity, then perhaps you're not the person to be doing the comms in the first place. However, assuming that you are, it's also okay to show that times are challenging for you too. You don't need to pretend that everything's okay. Your audience knows, well, in a situation like this, everybody's aware that things are not okay. Even if it's a crisis that impacts on your company directly and in a smaller scale way, people are going to be understanding that this is not something that is easy to deal with. So you don't need to pretend that it is. Be authentic in your response. And I seem to have got my points in the wrong order here, but firstly, again, step back, ask what your audience needs. And it's okay, ask them directly what they need. Pick up the phone, get on social media, or maybe don't get on social media, but pick up the phone, have the conversations and ask what they need. Then importantly, listen to what they tell you. Really listen to what it is that they want from you. Acknowledge their situation, and sometimes that's as easy as mirroring their language when you're speaking to them. Make sure that they understand that you understand, and then be realistic. Don't overpromise. It's always better to underpromise and overdeliver than it is to overpromise and then underdeliver. That's not going to do us any good. Finally, and as a great place to leave this, in times of crisis, it's important to always try to be kind, to have that compassion for people. If you're operating under stress, your judgment won't be at its sharpest, your temper might be fraying, you might be struggling to keep the panic at bay, and you might not be getting enough sleep. There's so many things that impact on your performance. It's also important to understand that those same things are often impacting on your audience. So it might be harder for them to digest what you're saying. It might make them quicker off the mark and quicker to misunderstand or to misconstrue what you're saying. And it also might make it easier for them or more likely for them to respond in a way which isn't perhaps as patient or appropriate as it should be. Crises often push us into unfamiliar and frightening situations. Sometimes that brings out the best in people, sometimes not. Across your communications, it's always better to err on the side of caution. So again, getting back to our first point, think carefully about your communications. Who is your audience? How are they impacted? What do they need to hear from you? And what is the right tone to strike in this situation? Externally, as a general rule, your communications should be friendly, strive to be calm and reassuring, should be practical, telling people what they need to know when they need to know it, and should be designed to build and maintain those really important relationships. Internal communications, be guided by your relationships, but keep it practical and pragmatic. Be realistic about what can and can't be done and what you're expecting from people. Again, keep it calm and reassuring as far as possible, and be responsive to people. Don't make it a one-way street. Allow that conversation to be happening and give yourself permission to adjust what you're saying and where you're going on the basis of what you hear back from people. So, to recap, calm and reassuring. Don't engage with negativity. Take it offline where you can. Connect personally. If something doesn't seem right, if people seem to be struggling, take it offline. In a situation like this, we could be dealing with people who are really struggling, and sometimes the channels just don't work in those situations. If you can, get them on a more personal level, and always err on the side of being kind. Crises expose our weaknesses, but they also provide an opportunity to demonstrate our strengths. If you can meet the needs of your audience in a crisis situation, it's likely going to be an experience that they will never forget. So, to wrap up all of this, stop, think carefully about what you're going to do, put your plans in place, and choose your words carefully. Good comms is not rocket science. Don't let my boss hear you say that, because we don't want to let the secret out, but it's not rocket science. It's more down to good thinking and good planning than it is to necessarily good comms skills. So don't let it scare you. Get out there and communicate with your audiences, even in times of crisis. Just make sure that you stop and think and put your plans in place as much as you can beforehand. If you need a hand with your comms, or if you've got any questions out of this webinar, I'm more than happy to have a chat to you about it, or you can email me. I'll pop my details up, and you can come back and listen to this webinar again anytime right through until the end of September. And of course, there's a host of other webinars and other content that you can have a look at in the virtual trade show, which I hope will also help you get through the current situation.